The U.S. has never been this distracted and vulnerable. The IDF officially issued a warning calling on all the civilian population in the northern Gaza Strip to evacuate. Iranian Foreign Minister launched a scathing attack on the U.S. and Israel while addressing the United Nations General Assembly. The Pentagon held a press briefing after Iran backed attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. Netanyahu says that Gaza war has entered a new stage and will be long and difficult. Iran threatens U.S. on American soil, and critics say the attack on Israel should be a wake-up call for America. Check this out.
We don't need to wait for another 9/11. You also look at the fact that, Kristen, America is incredibly distracted and incredibly divided. And when America's distracted, the world is less safe. And look at what happened to Israel. They waited for them to be distracted. And that's when your enemies move in. America needs to wake up. We need to put this negativity and division behind us. And we need to focus on national security for ourselves and for our friends.
I mean, I really don't think it's hard to see the fact that our military is being spread all over the world. At the same time, our borders are wide open, north and south, allowing non-vetted military-age men in by the thousands. But really, Nikki Haley, that critic in the clip, she's a presidential hopeful for the GOP and does make a good point about how we don't need to wait for another 9/11 and that America right now is incredibly distracted and incredibly divided. And when America's distracted, the world is less safe. Like she said, look at what happened to Israel. They waited for them to be distracted, and that's when your enemies move in. So yeah, guys, America needs to wake up. The attack on Israel caught Israeli defenses off guard in what some experts are describing as a catastrophic intelligence failure in an area where fighting is not uncommon. Haley also mentioned how Iran has been targeting the U.S. through our open border, and that Iran said the easiest way to get into America is through the southern border. Republican Senator Tom Cotton has also mentioned how the Border Patrol has encountered 146 known foreign terrorists attempting to cross the southern border, a nearly 50% increase compared to last year's 98 encounters. And that's just the ones that they caught. No one knows actually how many made it through without being detected. Now, apparently, while terrorists have long tried to cross our border, they have never done so in such great numbers. During the previous administration, an average of only 3 foreign terrorists attempted to cross our southern border illegally each year. Now, we definitely need to pay attention, guys. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel and tap that notification bell. And don't forget to light up the like button so that more and more people can see this before this video gets deleted. You know how they love to censor this kind of stuff, right, guys? So my friends and I were just talking about the whole America situation. They compared it to how coyotes will sneak attack a dog. 2 come in from the front and get attention while a third comes in from behind to initiate the attack. It honestly feels like we could be the dog right now. You know what I mean, guys? It's like we talk all the time about how the real impact of the Israel-Hamas war on America, and more importantly, the American people. I mean, first, it could definitely be an opportunity for our enemies to take advantage. For one, the Israel-Hamas conflict is an opportunity for Putin. Think about it. Time is an ally of Russia in the Ukrainian conflict. Russia needs to reduce its rate of battlefield deaths and remain militarily active in Ukraine for as long as possible. A great aid to Vladimir Putin would be a disruption in the supply of weapons to Kiev and a diminishing commitment from the European and U.S. governments to support the war or to provide military equipment. A rival crisis to distract Ukraine's allies, something like war in the Middle East, could provide just this. Hamas launched a violent attack into Israel from Gaza on October 7th, which has already caused a diplomatic distraction for the United States. Pretty soon, this conflict could lead to a redirection of military resources to the Middle East instead of Ukraine, depending upon whether Israel decides to reoccupy Gaza. You see where I'm going with this, right, guys? And Putin is just loving every second of it. Now, if you zoom out even more, a wider Middle Eastern conflict or a potential Chinese attack on Taiwan could divert the attention and resources of Ukraine's allies away from supporting the Ukraine. It's important to note that Russia benefits from this situation as well, even if it's not necessarily the instigator. The tension in Israel and Gaza distracts from a lot of global issues, including the upcoming U.S. presidential election and already high alert world order due to conflicts in Ukraine, China-Taiwan relations, and Serbia-Kosovo issues. Because if you look at what's happening with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, time seems to be on Russia's side. Factors like a change in U.S. leadership, concerns in U.S. Congress about funding for the Ukraine, and the U.S. involvement in the Middle East could all influence the eventual outcome of the conflict in the Ukraine. I hate to say this, guys, but I know you want the truth. If the war in the Ukraine continues into 2025, Russia may have the upper hand, and that just means an even weaker U.S. Just look at history. After 9/11, China grew into a superpower as a distracted U.S. fixated on terrorism. 20 years ago, White House officials were worried about China and tensions were rising. On April 1st, 2001, a Chinese fighter jet collided with a U.S. EP-3 reconnaissance plane off of China's coast, forcing Americans to make an emergency landing on Chinese territory. The Chinese detained the U.S. crew for 11 days and carefully inspected the sophisticated aircraft before they handed it over. Washington accused the Chinese fighter pilot of recklessly flying. Beijing demanded an apology. At the time, the Bush administration's view was that China was America's next major adversary. But does anybody remember that from 2001? No, of course not, because on the morning of September 11th, Al-Qaeda extremists hijacked 4 airliners and crashed 3 of them into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Virginia. America's attention abruptly shifted to the war on terror. U.S. troops deployed to Afghanistan and the Middle East, and the challenge posed by China was set aside for nearly 2 decades. Experts called it an incredible geopolitical gift to China. They said that it was a huge mistake for the United States to focus on the war on terror because the real challenge was going to come from China. Why? Because while the U.S. was busy fighting wars, China was busy trading. China's gross domestic product jumped from $1.2 trillion in 2000 to more than $14.7 trillion in 2020. Now, while the U.S. was distracted fighting Islamist militants in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, China had all the time in the world to grow their economic and military strength. And boy, did they do that. Beijing built up its missile arsenal, extending its reach in the South China Sea by constructing artificial islands, stole intellectual property on a massive scale, and pursued predatory trade tactics. After the tragedy of 9/11, China quickly recognized that the United States was shifting its strategic attention thousands of miles away, moving from the East China Sea and the Taiwan Strait to focus on Afghanistan. This shift provided China with an opportunity to quickly develop coercive military capabilities, all to expand their influence in East Asia. The U.S. reportedly spent around $8 trillion on the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and its broader counterterrorism efforts. Now, just imagine how that money could have been used for research and development, modernizing our infrastructure, creating advanced weaponry, and all other opportunities that we missed in the past 2 decades. Experts say that absent 9/11, you potentially would have had a faster shift in the U.S. strategy towards China in a more competitive direction. At a minimum, you would have had a faster shift in the U.S. defense strategy. Plus, we had president after president thinking that if Washington opened up global markets to Chinese industry, the Chinese government would gradually open up the country's political system and play a more cooperative role on the world stage. Now we're just struggling to catch up. Both parties agree about the need to get tough. Both Biden has kept former President Donald Trump's tariffs on China, and lawmakers and corporations are pushing for measures to promote the U.S. microchip industry, invest in research, and safeguard the U.S. technology sector from industrial espionage. Some experts say valuable time was lost, that the U.S. still lacks a long-term strategy about how to counter China, and that the country's polarized politics threaten to distract it from the main task at hand. In short, we may already be in a financial disaster. And it's scary to think about what a potentially wider Israel-Hamas war could mean for the U.S. economy, already facing stress on people's pocketbooks. Some economists and oil industry analysts already predict that a potential escalation of the Israel-Hamas war and the possibility that it could widen into a regional conflict could send gas prices well above $5 a gallon, if not closer to $10 a gallon in certain states within the United States. Can you imagine that, guys? Well, actually, you don't have to. We just have to remember what happened last year when gas prices were nearly that high. And you know this isn't just going to send oil prices soaring. It would hike costs on not only gasoline, but also for consumer products that depend on diesel and fuel to transport the products to and from warehouse, factories, to local store and retail store locations. In the event, for example, of a potential outcome that puts Israel in direct conflict with Iran, a major oil producer, the resulting price shock could cause a U.S. economic downturn that triggers layoffs, especially since there's still a lot of uncertainty about the potential scope of the war and its economic implications. One analyst described it as possibly pushing the U.S. economy into a ditch. Everywhere you look, it's going to be more expensive. It will feel like a really strong tax on our pocketbooks. Top economic policymakers have also mentioned their uneasiness about the whole thing. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said in New York City that geopolitical tensions are highly elevated and pose important risks to global economic activity. At the International Monetary Fund's annual meeting in Morocco earlier this month, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen downplayed the global economic impact of the war. But she told Bloomberg it's critically important that the conflict not spread. Another economist predicted that if the war expands to the point of direct intervention from Iran and the United States, it would bring more severe global economic consequences, spiking the price of oil to more than $150 per barrel and slowing economic activity as consumers and businesses contend with elevated prices. This could then reduce U.S. inflation-adjusted GDP growth over a year-long period by 1.2%, about $500 billion in lost productivity if you think about it. And you know that's going to hit Americans hard. As they said, consumers have a lot of domestic concerns right now, but we also have to know how rapidly geopolitical developments can evolve. I mean, really, any form of shock could have a larger effect on the economy and on consumers. Already, the Israel-Hamas war is affecting the financial outlooks of some of the larger companies. Some of the world's most well-known companies are already seeing the Israel war weighing on operations. Corporations that do business or have operations in the region have already begun seeing the war change their financial outlooks, considering everything from advertising dollars to tourism to supply chains. United Airlines said that fourth quarter performance could vary depending upon the length of flight suspensions in Tel Aviv. United is one of several carriers, including Delta Airlines and American Airlines, that have rushed to change schedules as conflicts has unfolded. Across the travel industry, the war is on the mind of corporate leaders. Plane makers Boeing said in a regulatory filing that the conflict could potentially affect certain supplies in addition to airlines. Technology companies saw a slowdown in ad spending. Facebook Meta said that they've seen softer advertising spending so far in the quarter just at the start of the conflict. They also saw a similar trend of cooler spending with the start of the conflicts, such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year. They're saying it's something that they're continuing to monitor. But I think it's pretty clear. We need to pay attention as this war definitely impacts us here at home. More on this in the next one, you guys. Be safe.